Okay, so September 1913 is one of Yeats' polemical poems. In other words, it was written to make specific political points. It's an interesting poem in that it ties with other Yeats poems in the course: Easter 1916, Stairs Nest by My Window, and The Second Coming, in that it charts Yeats' political evolution in the second decade of the 20th century. In this poem, Yeats displays attitudes typical of nationalist politics at the time when the poem was written. He describes his outrage and sense of disillusionment at the nature of Irish society in 1913, which he believed to be materialistic. It is understood that this poem was inspired by a decision by Dublin Corporation to turn down an application to build an art gallery for the Hugh Lane collection. Hugh Lane was a magnificent collector of modern art, and there was a campaign, Yeats was involved in the campaign, which wanted to build a gallery for the Hugh Lane collection where the Halfpenny Bridge in Dublin is today. So when Yeats writes this poem, he's angry, and he's making points about how Irish society, in his opinion, has lost its way. He wants a return to romantic idealism. He wants a return to the idea of sacrifice. He wants a return to a time when the individual was less important than the public good. The poem is tremendously interesting because it ties in nicely, stylistically and thematically, with these poems here. Let's talk briefly about the important quotes to learn from this poem. First of all, in the opening stanza, he takes an aggressive stance when he speaks to you being the people of Ireland. And he says, "What need you, being come to sense, but fumble in a greasy till, and add the halfpence to the pence, and prayer to shivering prayer, until you have dried the marrow from the bone." Now, this is all examples of Yeats' use of imagery, his use of symbolism, his use of metaphor. All those things, of course, tied together, all examples of figurative language, different ways of saying the same thing. And Yeats is famous for his use of symbolism and figurative language. The greasy till. This is Yeats' attack on what he perceives to be Irish society's obsession with money. The use of the word greasy is an adjective that he adds to the noun till, and that adjective noun combination is very striking and creates a sense of how unpleasant the till is, and the till for him is representative of our obsession with money, as indeed is the petty halfpence being added to the pence. He also is critical of not only Ireland's mercantile class, that's the people who run the businesses that have the tills, but also Ireland's religious culture. He regards Ireland's obsession with Catholicism as cowardly, and so he refers to the shivering prayer. So this is a depiction of an Ireland obsessed with money and fearful of damnation, and an Ireland in which the marrow is being dried from the bone. And that's a brilliant example of metaphor. It's a brilliant example of Yeats' capacity to create one image which sums up a very complicated and difficult or abstract idea. That's what metaphor should do. It should help the reader understand in a straightforward, simple, and easily accessible way a complex and abstract idea. To dry the marrow from the bone is to take the very life force from a living creature. And what Yeats is saying here is that Irish society's dual obsession with money, material goods, and religion is sucking the soul from the nation. And that's why he says, romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave, after saying, with a great touch of irony and sarcasm, for men were born to pray and save. He does not believe that men were born to pray and save. This line here is a reference to John O'Leary, who was a Fenian activist, or an Irish Republican activist, who had died the year the poem was written. And what Yeats is saying is that O'Leary is a symbol of Ireland's romantic or glorious past because he gave up his life in pursuit of the greater good. In 1913, Yeats is thinking of the greater good and how we must sacrifice our own interests for that good. Now that changes as he evolves and as the violence that he theorizes in this poem becomes reality in Easter 1916. There's not a lot else in the poem that's hugely interesting. That line is repeated at the end of the second stanza and the third stanza, and is repeated in part at the end of the poem. That is called a refrain when a poet does that at the end of a stanza. It's a form of repetition, and as always, with repetition, the line is repeated in order to create emphasis, to draw the reader's attention to the point being made by the poet. And the point being made by the poet is that John O'Leary might be dead, but he has also taken with him our sense of national identity, and it has been swapped for something petty and pathetic and, in Yeats's view, contemptible. The second stanza, he describes in a celebratory way the sacrifice of heroes of the past. He thinks of people who he lists in the third stanza: Edward Fitzgerald, one of the United Irishmen; Robert Emmet, whose abortive rebellion in 1803 resulted in his execution; Wolfe Tone, another United Irishman. These are Irish rebels. He references the wild geese. This is a term that was used to describe the leaders of Gaelic Ireland, Hugh O'Neill amongst them, who fled Ireland in the first decade of the 17th century, the 1600s, following the end of the 9-Year War. Yeats here talks about these people and says they were different. They were of a different kind. The names that stilled your childish play. They have gone about the world like wind. Little time had they to pray, for whom the hangman's rope was spun. So what he's doing in this poem is he's romanticizing the idea of violence, romanticizing the idea of sacrifice. He's calling on Irish society to remember these heroes of the past, to be inspired by them, because he finds the present, which he symbolizes with the greasy till, the shivering prayer, and the marrow being dried from the bone, he finds it loathsome and, as I said, contemptible. And that's really it. There's not a lot more in the poem. This reference here, where he says, if we could call these men back and we were to meet people like this today, he's not actually talking about bringing those particular men back to life. He's talking about if we had men like that again. He's talking in 1913. If we had heroes willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good, we'd call them madmen, he says. You'd cry, some woman's yellow hair has maddened every mother's son. The reference to some woman's yellow hair is a reference to Kathleen Ni Houlihan, who was the personification of Ireland, the female personification of Ireland. And he ends the poem, they weighed so lightly what they gave, but let them be, they're dead and gone, they're with O'Leary in the grave. Now, in terms of the content of the poem, that's it. It's a poem in which he makes, in aggressive, outraged language, a critique of the society which he sees all around him, and it's a poem in which he calls for a return to the violent nationalism of the past, because he romanticizes that nationalism as something beautiful. It's something he really regretted later in his life, writing those lines. He really regretted that men may have read that poem and been inspired to go out and sacrifice their life, and indeed the lives of others, to pursue the romantic dream that we see him explore in the poem Easter 1916. I'll make a little video on Easter 1916 and post it as well. One last thing to note, do a little bit of counting. Look at the first line. What need you being come to sense, but fumble in a greasy till, and add the halfpence to the pence. The poem is written in metre. There's rhyming. And the metre and the rhyming, you don't have to talk about anything. You don't, and I wouldn't go into any detail about the type of metre or the type of rhyming. All you have to say is that the metre and the rhyming gives the poem a rhythm that is notable and creates a sense of movement and momentum in the poem. And the only reason I'm mentioning that is because it's so typical of his style. You see the same thing, rhythm, movement, momentum, metre, rhyming, in Easter 1916, in The Stairs Nest by My Window, Sailing to Byzantium, in all of his poems. That is September 1913.